Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining Fran and I at our 20th episode of the Hopenning. The Hopenning is a place where hope is happening when you open yourself up to it. And Fran and I are so privileged to have you here in this space that we try to create for ourselves and invite you to join us. Fran is my co-host and she is a teacher. She's been a 33-year-long teacher in elementary school age, children's age. And Fran is also a wonderful rapid transformational therapy practitioner, helping a lot of people. And I know there are a lot of you here. And my name is Marina, and right now I am in a hotel room in Kelowna, British Columbia. I'm a full-time rapid transformational therapy practitioner. I'm a musician, and it's just my heart to be here and bring you some hope. So today we are still on the very important subject of grief. And I'm handing this over to Fran today to tell us her very intimate journey with grief and some wonderful things she has learned along the way. So Fran, all over to you.
Thank you, Marina. Yes, today we're talking about grief, sadness, and compassion, and how they're all really closely interlinked and the reasons for that. And so my grief journey really began when I was about 26 years old. So at that time, I was finishing my last year of university for my teaching degree. And I was actually going to university in Yorktown, Calgary, Alberta. I'm sitting in a university classroom. I'm 7 hours away from my home in Northern Alberta, and listening to the prof. It's a Monday morning, and there's a security guard shows up at the door, and the prof was startled, and she asked if we could help him. And he had a piece of paper in his hand, and he said, "Yes, is Fran Matula here?" And I was just shocked, right? Of course. And I stood up, I left my stuff there in the desk, and I walked to the door, and he handed me the piece of paper. He said, "It's important that you phone this number." Well, it was my mom's phone number. And so I went to the phone booth. There was one close by in the hallway. I phoned home. I thought something had happened to my dad. It was harvesting season. It was September. My dad would get careless when he was busy. I thought something happened to Dad. So I phoned home, and Mom answered, and she's crying. And I'm like, "Mom, is everything okay?" "No, Franny, we lost our little Bobby today." Well, Bobby was 13 years old, and he also had Down syndrome. So I'm like, "What do you mean you lost him? Well, did he wander away? How's he lost?" "He died this morning. He died getting on the school bus. Franny, he died getting on the school bus." And of course, my stomach just fell out of I couldn't believe it. You know, he was 13 years old. I had seen him 2 weeks before. How could this be? And so, yes, I did go home for that immediately, of course. And, it was interesting because you see the household, I was traveling from a fair distance away. So people were there already with my mom. People had brought food. Neighbors were dropping in, all of that stuff that people do when they're grieving. And my oldest sister, who was in her 30s at the time, who had children of her own that were actually older than Bobby, was busy cleaning. She was busy washing clothes and stuff like that. And I just didn't know what to do. Like, what do you do? And so because I had no previous experience with grief, I really didn't know how to process my own grief, as well as help my mom, whose heart was breaking. And I really do believe that my mom's heart broke at that time because she died of heart complications later. And so it was interesting to watch my parents at the funeral. We're Catholic, so we had an open casket. There was my little brother right there in the casket, and my parents are sitting in the first row to see him. And my mom's got just sobbing, right? My mom is just sobbing. And there's my dad and he's just dabbing at his eyes. He's dabbing at them. They have they still have the same amount of grief, and yet they're handling it in two different ways. And my dad wouldn't even let the tears roll down. He would dab them out of his eyes. He would not even let the tears out. He wouldn't let anyone see that, right? Because that's the way he was raised. And so we children were also raised that way. There were 11 of us that were older than my youngest brother. And so we were never taught how to process grief. We were never taught this. We were taught to be strong and not to show sadness and just compliance. You just showed compliance, and you just didn't express your emotions that way. And so fast forward it to now in my lifetime, I've had multiple experiences with different types of grief. In the meantime, both my parents have passed away. I've had a second brother that passed away. I've had brothers-in-law that have died. And you begin to understand that there's a way to move through your grief. That grief, a shared grief, is really, really important to how we process our own. And so, Marina, I know that you've gone through a lot of losses in your life as well. And those of us that have carried sadnesses in our lives for whatever reason, because of past trauma or because of grief, because of suffering, we have an ability to walk in the shoes of others. We understand feelings. We understand loss. We understand suffering. And there's a scientific base to this. And so I will get into that later. I love the science behind it all. And so the fact that we can walk in another person's pair of shoes, we can feel the stones underneath their feet as we walk in those shoes, makes us better therapists because we understand what it's like. And so our viewers, I want our viewers to see how they respond. We've got a video that was created by the Cleveland Clinic, and it's a large hospital in the United States. It was created as a training video for their staff to help their staff become more empathetic, more sympathetic, more compassionate to what the patients within the building are going through. And the video will show you exactly the people involved, but it'll also have captions to show us, the viewer, what that patient is actually going through. And I want you to watch your own feelings and see if they mirror what Marina and I are going through as well. And I'm sure they will. So let's take a look at that video. Marina, you know, as I read through several of those captions, I thought of
Just want
you.
to turn this off. Just bear with me. There you go. Okay, fine.
I thought of you as I read through some of those captions. And I mean, and I thought of myself, but I also thought of other people that I knew that were in those same situations. And I probably, you're like me, that I had a hard time not tearing up. And I've watched this video a few times now, and every time I do tear up. And you know, I like a shiver runs through my body. And how about yourself, Marina? How did you feel
Yeah,
watching that?
I mean, there were quite a few relatable scenes for me, and I know you know that. So, um, yeah, it's so easy for all of us. What crossed my mind is that we wear masks every single day, and it's not always that we really let people know, and we don't show really how we feel. And what you said about your mom losing your brother so young, it's interesting because I thought about how many clients I've had now who would go back to a scene when they were children and they've lost a sibling. And in our generation, you were just not taught to mourn that. And another thought that came to me is when you lose a pregnancy, when you have a miscarriage, that's a huge loss that people don't really emphasize today. It's just literally, well, move on. So yes, that really, that was a beautiful video. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I agree. We are not taught how to do this, and it's the life experiences that teach us how to do it to some extent, right? And those of us that are so hardwired to not show grief, to not show pain, suffering, and all of that. You know, some people die in the same way, never telling others how they felt, or not never experiencing that profound sense of sharing the loss with others. And you know, the ability to share with others is necessary for humanity, and it stems from science. It turns out that we are all have something called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is those parts of our body that is right from the beginning of conception. The vagus nerve is one of the first things that are built in an embryo, right? And the vagus nerve is extremely important. It's what goes throughout the body, and it carries, you know, the need for food, the need for affection, and those types of basic needs, right? But it turns out that the vagus nerve is something that's also stimulated when we see the sadness of others. So when you and I were watching that video and I got goosebumps, and I could feel that. I could feel that suffering. Well, that's innate to our science, our bodily science. We're hardwired that way to feel the suffering of others. And there's actually a part of the brain called the anterior cortex that fires this at the same rate. The person who's feeling the sadness in the video and us, both our parts of the brain fire at the same time. Just me watching that fires that part of my brain. And it's actually a pain inside of me. It's a pain. And so, yeah, human nature is, I don't like feeling pain. Okay, I don't like it. So when I see somebody who's suffering, who's in grief, who's in loss, my first thing to do is to stop their grief so that I don't have to feel it, because it's natural. And you know, if they're in grieving and sadness, I want to fix that. I want to say the platitudes. Chaz Wesley calls them inconsequential platitudes. You'll have another baby. They're in a better place now. at least their suffering is over. All those platitudes that we sometimes say to make that person feel better, it's so that we feel better. Science, the anatomy of the body is outstanding. And so there's, it's understandable that we wouldn't have said the right words at the time of somebody else's grief, or that we wouldn't have known what to do to help them through it. It's understandable. But as we get older and we understand our own grief and we've gone through our own grief, we know that we don't want the platitudes. The platitudes do not help anything. All it really does is negate the sense of loss that we have, right? It says, like if you were telling me, Fran, you have 10 more siblings. You lost a little brother, but you have 10 more. All that would have done was cause me to think, okay, maybe I shouldn't be so sad. Maybe she's right. I do have, the logical side of my brain. Yes, I do have 11 more siblings, but I really miss him and I really grieve for him. But then the logical side of me says, but how about, then you're caught in this confusion of how am I supposed to really grieve, which is, I have gone through it. You perhaps have gone through it too. And so the whole process of grief is really important. So people have studied grief for a long, long time. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she's forefront in the study of grief. She started in the 1950s, right? She looked at thousands of people. And what she found when it was a sudden death, a sudden loss, was there were 5 stages of grief. There was the denial, there was bargaining, there's anger, there's depression, and then there's acceptance. And that holds true. But there's also the spiraling of the grief that we go through as we feel other people's grief. So as we're watching that video, I'm thinking about, the DNR, the do not resuscitate. That was, when my dad, he had a DNR order as well. I remember him and I remember going through that grief with him. And then the cancer, finding out the cancer is malignant. I remember my brother, and I experienced that grief again, seeing somebody else's grief. And that's human anatomy. That's just the way the body is built. And so there's a movie called Inside Out. Have you watched that movie?
I'll have to ask my husband. I never remember movie names.
So it's a Pixar movie. It's
Okay.
Pixar, it's the animated. And I watch it every year because my students watch it, and so I watch it again. And every time I watch it, I just think it's brilliant. It's brilliantly done. So the Pixar movie, it was started in 2007, I think, is they first started animating it. And the Pixar movie Inside Out is about a little girl who lives in Minnesota. And she does all the fun things that you get to do when you live kind of out in the country, right? She lives where you can skate and where you can hang out with friends after school and all that stuff. And her family moves to San Francisco. And she goes through a huge grieving as she leaves her friends, and then she leaves a sports that she likes to do, and she enters a new school and she feels ostracized and she feels alone. And the movie is about how the emotions in her body are all personified. And the creators of Pixar had decided originally to make the 2 most important emotions joy and fear. And they chose those 2 emotions because joy is like the protagonist, the personified protagonist, and fear is always funny. So it was supposed to be a comedy. And yet, after 3 years into the animation of the movie, the person who was responsible for the animation felt a real discontent with the movie. It was ready to go to production, and he felt a real discontent. He felt that there was something missing. And so he contacted a University of Berkeley professor of psychology to find out what's missing in this movie. You know, we've got Joy, the protagonist emotion, who tries to regulate the emotions of the little girl, right? And then we've got fear about all the things that might happen, and we've got anger, and we've got disgust. But the one emotion that they missed out was the emotion of sadness. And when the University of Berkeley professor told the animation crew on Pixar, yeah, sadness is paramount. Sadness and joy have to be the two protagonists, because without the one, you don't know the other. And that's extremely relevant in life. Without sadness, you don't understand joy. We all need to feel sadness. Those of us that have gone through grieving and suffering and loss, sadness, that emotion of sadness is paramount, because until we feel sadness and process sadness, we can't fully process joy either. And that's what the animators learned. And they wrote a role for the role of sadness. Sadness became a second protagonist in the movie, and it ended up that Pixar movie was the highest grossing movie that Pixar had ever created, even made more money than the movie Up or the movie Monsters Inc. So I mean, if you know movies, you'll know these ones. And so it also received an Oscar. So it's interesting, because sadness and joy are necessary in lives. And that is why at funerals, like we've had big funerals. We're Catholics. Catholics have big funerals. And so I remember going home for the funeral of my brother. And of course, it's extremely sad. But when you get to that many people together, there's also joy moments when you reminisce. You reminisce, and that brings joy back. You laugh about these moments, and you're laughing through your tears, because it's this melancholy, it's a bittersweet, right? Because you remember all the antics, you remember the fun times, you remember those things that are so binding. Yes, and so both emotions, joy and sadness, are binding emotions. We can't have one without the other. And as we go through grief, we share our grief with others, and others allow us to live in our grief, to sit with us, to experience our grief. We are able to process that, and that is so important to the grieving process. It is also really interesting that even though compassion is an emotion that's a basic emotion, compassion for others, because it's hardwired into us to be compassionate to others, we see that those of us that live in entitlement, higher social status, and have a feeling of superiority have a hard time being compassionate. And so it's super interesting, isn't it, Marina? Like I think people come to mind immediately, people that are in higher status positions that have harder time feeling compassion. It's like, yeah, you can take the 3 days off of work, and then we expect you to be back at work. Or there's other times where there might be someone suffering in our family, and we want to be able to spend the time with them, but the procedure number 10.7 says that we're allowed to take 2 days if it's a close family member, but if it's only 1 day if it's a further away family member. Like, who made these rules up, right? But they're true. Like, organizations have rules about how long we're allowed to spend with grief with those of us experiencing loss. And it's really bizarre, because what kind of a culture does that? Puts a time limit on grief. But yeah, so social status prevents some of us from understanding and being able to experience and give compassion to others. Even the word compassion, if we break it apart, calm is the root word for community. It's shared, it's belonging, it's a togetherness. And passion, of course, means suffering. So when you put the word compassion together, it means shared suffering. And so those people who don't understand compassion, they have found that even these people in a clinical setting, when they tested these people out, these people didn't stop for pedestrians. These people got more anxious at red lights, or when the car in front of them took longer to move ahead at the red light. These people also took more candy off the plate that was offered to them. So it's all interesting. It's like the higher our social status, the less likely we are to be able to express compassion in a natural way. And so there's ways of helping ourselves to become more compassionate. And they teach this to higher end CEOs of big corporations who don't really maybe not understand compassion. They teach ways of building compassion. And one of them is by the humble process of bowing. You've seen this before. When I travel to Nepal, everybody does it, right? It's so in their culture to put the hands together and bow whenever you meet anyone, even if it's for the 500th time that day. The doorman will bow like this. Every person behind the counter in the hotel will bow like this. Even just the process of bowing, it will activate the vagus nerve to help us become more compassionate. Those of us that pray, right? We pray like this. It's Who would have thought, right? It activates the vagus nerve to help us become more compassionate. Um, if we are, if we start writing down times that we feel compassion, times that others were compassionate to us, it builds our ability to be compassionate. And what's paramount to you and I in our practice is building our own self-compassion helps us to be compassionate to others. And so as we build our own compassion for ourselves, so in order to build our own self-compassion for how we feel about things, rather than brushing it off, oh, Fran, it was just a whatever. Oh, Fran, you'll get over it. Don't take it so personally, Fran, right? If we can build it for ourselves, as we build it for ourselves, we learn how to be more compassionate to others. There's a natural flow to that. And so what do you do to build your own self-compassion, Marina?
Well, I think I'm on this journey of self-compassion anyway, Fran. It's to me, a lot of the answers for anything in love starts with self-love. And if you cannot learn to love yourself, then and have compassion for yourself, then everything else in life goes wrong. Whenever I have a client who comes to me because they want love in their life, I teach them to love themselves first. And compassion is part of that. Be gentle with yourself. Don't be so hard on yourself. And so that's something that um, a lot of things in my life started to go right when I stopped being so hard on myself. And I'm not perfect by all means. I'm still very hard on myself. But I find if I'm hard on myself, I'm almost harder on other people. But if I give myself a break, it's so much easier to give other people a break. So I think everything starts with me. It starts here.
Exactly. 12-step programs. 12-step programs are brilliant. They have it built in because those people that end up being addicts, right? It's self-medicating. It's so that we don't feel our own pain, so that we don't feel those feelings that are so hard to feel. So we become addicts, whether it's an addict with food, whether it's an addict of substance abuse or gambling or whatever the addiction is. It's so that we don't have to face our feelings. And so a 12-step program has it built right in. We learn compassion for ourselves first, and then that can be a compassion that we are able to give to others. And there's a process to learning self-compassion and self-love. And the first thing is, when that thought comes through, to stop, to recognize it, to recognize that thought. What is the thought? Maybe the thought was, Fran, don't worry about it. Don't take it personally. Don't be so hard on yourself. So let's stop and take that thought and look at that thought. Don't be so hard on yourself. Okay, so what's the feeling that goes with that thought? Okay, my feeling that automatically comes up is, there's something wrong with me. There's something wrong. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. Obviously, I'm not compassionate enough. Obviously, I was so stupid that I didn't know enough, right? So we recognize the feeling. I feel bad. I feel sad. I feel disgust for myself. I feel angry at myself. So when we can apply a label to the feeling, just the act of applying language, words to a feeling, helps us to use a different part of our brain. Instead of using the reptile brain, we start using the more informed part of the brain. So we're applying language to the feeling. Okay, so right now I'm feeling disgust for myself. Okay, let's talk about that. Yeah, I'm feeling disgusted with myself because I should have known better. I should have known better. And then when we can say that, I should have known better, then the other side of us can say, how would you have known better, Fran? How? You had no understanding of grief. You had no idea. You never did experience grief. You never were taught how to experience grief. Is it absolutely 100% true that you should have known better? And then the logical side can say, yeah, it's true. It's true. That's why I didn't know better. Just didn't know better. And so then the third part of it is to go with that person, that 26-year-old, be with that 26-year-old and go, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. And that 26-year-old might be a 5-year-old who watched their grandfather being buried and nobody helped them process their grief. And so as they're watching the grieving, watching people around them, watching the interactions between people and not understanding how to grieve properly. And so going to that little 5-year-old Franny and saying, it's okay, honey. It's okay. I understand. It's okay. You can cry. I'll be with you here while you cry, and I won't leave you. And allow that little 5-year-old or the 26-year-old or the 13-year-old just to experience the loss, the sadness, the hurt, the anger, the denial, all of those stages, and just be with them and let them move through it. Because as we let people move through their grief, they get a chance to process their grief, and they will come out better in the long run, and they will become more compassionate people because they've showed self-compassion.
So, Fran, tell me, if a client come to you and they would like to get over their grief in RTT, how would you help them?
Yeah. I had a client recently, actually, and she was a young mother. She had two babies, actually, two young babies. And cancer was rampant in her family of origin, rampant. And she just found out that she's only in her 30s, and she just found out that her younger sister had breast cancer. And so in her family, it's a death sentence, right? Because she had so many losses from cancer. And so in the therapy session, we went back and yeah, the sessions that came up were, she was a young child, and her first one was her uncle dying. She loved her uncle, and he was dying. He had been a strong firefighter. He, in the session, you know, her memory was of him throwing her up in the air and catching her and throwing her. He was a strong fireman. And there he was on his deathbed, right? Frail. And then the second one, it was her grandmother dying of cancer, and her snuggling up beside her grandmother, and her grandmother with the gray hair and big glasses, you know, and snuggling up there. And that was one more. And another one was when her auntie, her beloved auntie, died. And the last one was when her uncle died. And this was all between the ages of 10 and 13. All those 4 deaths were within the space of 3 years, and nobody talked about it. Her parents didn't talk about it. Nobody talked about it. And there was just multiple layers of grief on top of each other. And so it was so easy for her to see why this idea that she really believed that she's going to die of cancer, and that she would leave her 2 little babies, right? And that her sister will die of cancer without ever having experienced children of her own. And so that's what we worked with. We worked taking her back to these scenes of the grief, the moments, and taking her and helping her to talk to her uncle, who was the firefighter, and hold her uncle for the last time, you know, and allow her uncle to hold her, and her uncle to just say, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And take her back to her grandma and let her snuggle in with her grandma and say, I love you so much, grandma. And this time her parents wouldn't take her away, right? Because that's what was always happening. Her parents would always take her away, trying to shield her from grief. But what in the meantime it didn't allow her to spend the time with the people that were dying and to have a real good, solid goodbye. I loved you so much. And so that's what we did in our practice together. It was beautiful. It was
That's
beautiful.
absolutely wonderful. So, Fran, what can you leave our audience today with? What advice? You've shared so much today. So if you can give them a few points to help them the next time they face this, or if they're currently facing this, what would you give them today?
So anyone who's grieving right now, what I would say is feel your feelings, feel them, whatever it is. And, you know, I think that sometimes people who are going through grieving think that they have to be sad, otherwise it's not honoring the person who died. They have to be sad. They have to wear the black. Like I know a woman who wore black for 3 years because that's what they were supposed to do in their culture. And okay, that sounds interesting. It's not something I would do. However, feel the feelings. And one way of feeling the feelings is listening to sad songs. And it sounds bizarre, right? You, poor person, would think, listen to a happy song, like just get happy, right? But actually listening to sad songs, listening to the really the minor songs, you're a singer, you understand the songs that are written in a minor key. Those are really heartfelt songs. Like those are songs that help you to cry. When my little brother died, that is one thing that was just innate in me. I listened to these same songs over and over, and every time I would listen to them, I would just cry. And it's not because it's a song that he and I listened to, but it's a song that compelled me over and over. I just needed to listen to that because it just helped to bring the tears. It helped bring the sobbing out. Another thing is listening to poetry. Read sad poetry. It helps to bring the sadness out. Art is really, if you love art, if you like to do art is a very good way of therapy, art therapy. Journaling is really important too. if you like that kind of stuff, right? Being with people that help you to sit with your grief, not somebody that will try to make you better. Okay. Unless it's a therapist, we've got our own, we've got a job. But if you're going to sit with friends or family, make sure it's people that will help you process your grief, not rush you through it and expect you to get over it so that they don't have to watch you in grief, which makes them feel sad as well, right? Sit with the right people, acknowledge your feelings, name them, and allow yourself to grieve, allow yourself to process.
Thank you so much, Fran. This was enlightening. It was very encouraging. Thank you for sharing your very personal story through your brother. And that was absolutely amazing. So next week, we are having another special guest, and I'm so excited about this. One thing that I think is becoming more and more important in our lives is pets. And I have personally experienced the loss of a pet and how absolutely devastating it is. And I have a dog in my life right now, and she's 10 years old. She's my shadow. And because we had to leave town yesterday, we left her with friends, and even just saying goodbye to her was difficult, and that's only for a week. So I ran across a lady when I did a writer's program a few years ago by the name of Julie Moore, and she wrote this book, The Pet Soul Book, a guide for letting go and connecting with your beloved pet. And I bought the book as soon as she published it. I think I was one of the first people who ordered it online. It's a guidebook, and I tell you, Fran, I read it again, and I invited Julie to be our guest next week. And the absolute beautiful advice for letting go from your pet, to me, is something you can buy this book to people who are letting go of a loved one as well. It's profound. It's beautiful, the things she has in here. So we are very honored to have Julie Moore as our guest next week. If any of you want to start to look into this book, I think every time now, when a friend of mine loses a pet, I will buy this book for them. The Pet Soul Book by Julie Moore. It is available on Amazon. I highly recommend it. So looking forward to having Julie with us next week. So, Fran, any last words before we say goodbye?
I am going to buy that book because I also lost a pet, and he was more than a pet. Well, you understand that. He was more than a pet. He was my running partner. He was my unconditional love. He was the one that put his nose underneath the fence waiting for me to come home so that he could see me walking down the driveway. And when I lost him, it wasn't the same. It was never the same.
No, that's really, really tough. And yes, so I am really looking forward to that. So again, this is the Hopenning, Fran and Marina, and thank you for joining us today. If you ever have any questions, you can just comment on here wherever you meet us, and we'll get back to you. So have a wonderful week.
Have a wonderful week.